Hey guys, John from RC Juice with another video from our bench here with yet another topic that we get lots of questions on, something that there seems to be a lot of confusion about. If you haven't guessed it, today we're going to be talking about motors. Specifically, we're talking about motor sizing and their names. For instance, like a 3660 motor, a 540 motor, a 4076 motor. We'll do our best to kind of explain that to you, hopefully clear this up. We would like to point out there is no governing body or any sort of steadfast rules that dictate what a motor sizing has to go by. So there are no steadfast rules in all of this. But again, there are some numbers that kind of apply to all motors, so we'll do our best to clear that up. As always, you can reach out to us if you have any more questions after the video. But with that, we're going to move the camera in, get closer to these motors so we can show you a few things, and again, hopefully clear this up for some of you guys. All right guys, we got the camera pulled in here. Hopefully you can see these motors a little bit better. We'll start down here at the end of the line. This is going to be one of the most common motors in all of RC. This is referred to as the 540 motor. So 540 in this case refers to the length of the motor. The motor is 54 millimeters in length. It's not 540. One can only assume they decided to go with 540 because it sounds cooler than calling it a 54. But again, that 5.4 relates to the motor being 54 millimeters long. Pretty much all 10th scale motors are 36 millimeters in diameter. The 540 name does not reference the diameter in any way. As we move down the line, you will see that that number naming for the motors does mention the length. Our best guess on this is that when all this started back in the day, in the early days of RC, pretty much everything was a 10th scale motor, so pretty much all motors were a 36 millimeter diameter, so it's almost as if they didn't need to refer to the diameter of the motor. Again, that's kind of a best guess, but as we mentioned earlier, there are no real rules for all this, so we kind of have to explain based on what we've seen out there. But again, this is a 540 motor, standard 10th scale motor, one of the most common sizes for motors in all of RC. Moving up from a 540, there is a 550 motor, which, as you can guess, is just simply a little bit longer. This is a 55 millimeter can, again, not a 550 millimeter, just 55 millimeters long. It's still going to be a 36 millimeter diameter motor. This is another 10th scale motor. A exception to all these rules, as we like to mention. So for instance, this is the Hobbystar Pro 4 motor. This guy is actually about 63 millimeters long. It is also a 36 millimeter diameter motor. This category of motor, sometimes you'll see it referred to as a 550L. That means that it's a 550 longer version. As you can see, it's going to be a longer can than a 550 motor at about 63 millimeters versus the 55 millimeters of this one. Both are 36 millimeters in diameter, but again, calling it a Pro 4 or 550L is not specific to the size itself. Again, this is just kind of one of those exceptions in RC. It's kind of a unique size motor. Moving on to that, we're going to start getting into motors where that number naming for the motor does actually refer to both the diameter and the length of the motor. Starting with a really small one. This is a Hobbystar 2435 motor. So on these motors, the first two numbers, usually that 24, are going to refer to the diameter of your motor. So in this case, obviously we got a 24 millimeter wide motor, and it's 35 millimeters long. So 2435, very simply, 24 millimeter diameter, 35 millimeter length. Then we can go into, you'll see these motors here, all four of these all have the same diameter. Again, all these are 10th scale motors. They are 36 millimeter diameter cans. This motor here is a 3650. It's 50 millimeters long. This motor here, 3660, simply 60 millimeters long. We got a 3665, and then we have a 3670. All these 36 millimeter diameter motors, they all get a little bit longer. As motors get longer, you can build more torque with those motors. As the advantage of a longer motor, you've got more magnet surface inside that motor, inside of the rotor. on which the magnetic forces can push on. So a longer motor can build more torque. That's why we've started seeing more of a variety of lengths in motors, where back in the day we pretty much had 540s and 550s, and now we have all different lengths for all kinds of custom applications. Moving on beyond that guy, we have a 3674 even, again, 36 millimeter diameter, 74 millimeters long, just a longer motor. Right next to this guy, this is also a 3670 motor. So both of these are 3670 motors. You'll notice that the main difference with these is one of these is a smooth can and this one has some cooling grooves cut into it. These here are inset, so the outside of the motor is actually flush. These cooling fins don't actually stick up, and we'll cover that shortly here on the 8th scale motors. In general, a smooth can motor can be used in a car or in a boat. The reason that you need a smooth can motor for a boat is that in boats, since your motor is closed up inside of the boat, you don't have airflow to help cool off that motor, so you need to run a cooling jacket like this guy. This will actually slide over the motor. There are some O-rings inside of there that will help trap water inside this jacket when it's around the motor, and you have some water lines that hook up to the top of it, and they'll actually circulate water around the motor for cooling. So for a boat motor, you do want that smooth can, and the smooth can being for your cooling jacket. So moving on now into 8th scale motors is where some of the confusion really comes in. So for instance, this here is a Hobbystar 4068 motor. As you probably guessed, the 40 refers to the diameter of the motor, the 68 does refer to the length of the motor. Now where the confusion comes in is this motor has raised cooling fins on it. So the diameter of the actual can itself versus the diameter of the motor, if you were to measure on the edges of the fins, is going to be slightly bigger since those fins come out from the motor can itself. So whereas Hobbystar refers to this as a 4068 motor, somebody else might refer to it as a 4268. That's just because they chose to measure on the outside of the fins. This goes back to what we mentioned at the beginning of the video, that there are no standards on how to name or measure these motors. So guys will just pick a different dimension of the motor to measure and go with. Some guys will use that 42 because it looks bigger. Well, it is a bigger number. Some people will associate bigger is better. But again, it's all the same size motor. All 8th scale motors are going to be 40 millimeter diameter cans themselves. Some have external fins. And again, you'll also find some 8th scale motors that aren't necessarily boat motors. For instance, Leopard. There are lots of Leopard motors. We sell those here at RC Juice. And Leopard motors tend to be more smooth can motors. They are starting to come out with more fin cans now. But most of their motors are smooth cans. Whereas in a Hobbystar motor, this is called a 4268. In Leopard, you can find a 4068. Same size motor. One's that's got cooling fins and the other one doesn't have cooling fins. The only other time you need to be kind of concerned at all with cooling fins might be is if you're using a motor in an application where it probably wasn't meant for. Most common is going to be is if you're running like an 8th scale motor inside a 10th scale vehicle. Sometimes that motor gets real close to the chassis. In some cases, the fins on the bottom of the motor, just that extra millimeter of fin sticking out all around can contact the chassis. You might sometimes have to grind them. Again, pretty rare, but it's just something to keep in mind when you are working on some custom applications. Beyond that, it's the same thing, again, with pretty much all 8th scale motors. This here is a 4076 motor. This is your standard 8th scale monster truck truggy motor. Again, 40 or 42 millimeter diameter like the 4068. But it's a longer motor, where the 4068 is going to be meant more for 8th scale buggies and lighter scale 8th scale vehicles. Your 4076 motor is for the trucks and truggies because it's got that longer can. So it's going to have larger magnets inside and you're going to be able to build more torque, which is what you want for a heavier vehicle. Again, now on to the 4274, which again, same diameter. This is a 4076. This is a 4274, same diameter cans. They just choose to go with the 42 designation. It's more to just differentiate it from the non-censored motor to the censored motor. Same can, one's called 40, one's called 42. It's just a naming thing. This is 74. This motor, not sure if you can see it in the camera, is slightly shorter than this guy, so they call it the 74. But again, basically the same motor. So 42, 74, 40, 76, about the same size can. One's censored versus non-censored, but even though they're different numbers, they're very similar size motors. Beyond that, we'll get into, like, for instance, longer motors. This is a Hobby Star 4082, same thing, 40 millimeters, 42 millimeters if you measure the fins, standard 8th scale diameter, but what we have here is a longer can for even more torque in some bigger, heavier vehicles that we're starting to see more and more of, and guys, of course, are always trying to push the envelope, get more speed out of cars, more power, so we are seeing more and more longer cans. Then we can even move into something like the 4585. And this motor is an even larger diameter. This is kind of what is sort of unofficially referred to as a 7th scale motor. This is the size motor that you'll see in things like the Traxxas X01 or the X-Max. We see a lot of guys running this size motor in speed run vehicles, in particular the ARMA vehicles. These things are a drop-in into ARMAs. Even though it's a bigger diameter motor, these do fit in pretty much all the ARMA 8th scale rigs. So again, these have gotten really popular with the ARMA guys and speed run crowd. Here we have a larger 5th scale motor, and again, the same rules apply to these motors. So this is going to be called a 5692 motor. Can diameter is 56 millimeters. The overall length is 92 millimeters. So again, where some of this confusion comes in, for instance, on some of the bigger 5th scale motors, a very popular size is a 56-110 motor. 56 refers to the diameter of the can. It'd be 58 if we were talking about the fins, but 56 is the can, and then 110 is going to be the length. So you can have a 56-110 motor, and you can also have a 58-110 motor. So most guys think there's a big difference between those two, and they want to know, should they go with a 58-110 versus a 56-110? So again, only difference is those fins. Those motors are about the same thing. In 5th scale motors, you'll see, for instance, some guys also sell a 56 or a 58-112. 112 versus 110, some motors sometimes will have like a little bit of a flange right up on top of the front plate that just sticks out a little bit. It doesn't really serve any purpose. It's just kind of the design of the motor, so some guys will actually add that into the measurement. So they'll call it a 112. So whereas one company might call a 5th scale motor a 56-110, somebody else might call it a 58-112 because they're measuring every possible bit of length and diameter to that motor. But it's important to understand that once you're within a couple millimeters of distances, you're pretty much talking about the same motor. So a 56-110, 58-112, it's the same thing. They're just trying to confuse you and try to make it look better by using bigger numbers on it.
Well, there you have it, guys. Hopefully this video has helped clear up some confusion as far as what all the numbers mean with relation to motor sizes. If you have any questions, as always, we're going to have a link to our contact info down in the description. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. As always, guys, we appreciate you watching, and we'll see you at the next one.